to leave no trace of what they had done, neither in the countries where they had actually inflicted violence, but they were absolutely determined, and diligently so, to make sure that no accounts of the violence that they had inflicted overseas came back to their own home nations. The majority of the populations in the European countries have no idea of what their real history is. They are blithely ignorant of the fact that their wealth, their societies, their civilization, as they call it, was actually established on 300-400 years of atrocities and acts of human violence, crimes against humanity, theft, etc. So it's really important that we have this conversation, that we share each other's understanding and learning. I think I'd like to start by explaining, perhaps using a simile, a metaphor. Imagine finding yourself on a football pitch where your side of the football pitch had lots of little landmines already planted, that your players were carrying a burden, a rucksack full of weight, that most of them didn't realize, but they were also, their ankles were tied together. And on the other side, you have a group who have been used to winning again and again and again because they have none of those encumbrances. This is a very similar situation that we find ourselves in now. We are not working against a neutral background. We are not playing on a level playing field. We are operating, we are functioning within international legal institutions, frameworks, legislation, the United Nations, etc. And all of these structures emerged during or after the colonial period. So the colonial period is the time when all of these structures were created. And I think there is a perfectly valid argument in saying that these structures were created with two things in mind. One was to perpetuate the idea of white Christian, Euro-Christian supremacy, and the other was to protect ill-gotten gains. You have probably heard that Emmanuel Macron is having a very difficult time in Africa, where the Africans are beginning to openly say, well, actually, why is France even interfering in our issues anymore? Please leave. We have just had the Germans declare that they acknowledge that in 1904, they inflicted the worst human atrocities upon the Namibians, and they did it in a manner which was duplicitous. It was a manner in which they concealed what they had done, but they finally accepted that they were responsible and apologized for it. So slowly we are now beginning to see all of the colonized nations say, well, actually, us recovering, us arriving at our full position in the world is only going to be possible if we go back a little bit in history and understand what the rules were, how they were created, and why they're biased against us. So it's really important that we do this. One of the most important things is that every Bharatiya, every Hindu, needs to learn not only the history of their own nation from Hindu authors and scholars, but they really need to know every dimension of colonialism. In the last 230 years, we need to know that. That should be the basis, the foundation upon which we then decide how do we move forward. And I think our conversation is really going to be helpful in pushing forward the understanding that we have to know ourselves. We have to control the, shall we say, the bandwidth, which is information being spread about who we are. We have to be the authors of our own propaganda, our own information, our own intelligence. And this is the beginning of that whole process. So I think this is going to be a wonderful exploration. And let's hope that more and more people jump in and get engaged and start to unearth their own history. There is an incredible discovery to be made yet.
One of my well, you said it very well. One of my favorite things is that one way to bring about change is participation and getting engaged in communities, in societies that we live in. And that's very important. By and large, we Indians are kind of a non-interfering people. You know, one of the things that I noticed in America was when I came here in '91, that the first generation Indians who came here, they came here, few came in the 50s, but the influx started from 60s onwards. They were India-born confused desis, because in India, none of us were taught about our values. We just were struggling to make a living. We came here, we were India-born confused desis because we were all keen to make an economic well-being for ourselves. And we adjusted, accommodated very quickly in the mainstream because we found things were so great. There was no competition, there was no rush, there was no interference. You could do whatever you wanted and you prosper. So the first generation Indians got involved in making themselves prosperous. Consequently, the joke went around, they ended up producing American-born confused desis because we wanted them to be like Mike, like American. Oh, Angrezi janta hai. He speaks like American, he speaks like an Englishman and whatever. So we began to take pride in saying that our children were so American, so British, and so foreigner, right? In the process, they were never imbibed with the virtues and cultures of our own way of life. Everything Firangi was superior, quote unquote, to everything Desi and our Hindu principles. Consequently, the last thing that came about, that I in a conversation with somebody very knowledgeable here, he said that majority of the people in America today, they are millions worth, 100 million net worth and all, they have resigned to the fact that our children are Hindus in name only, thus the acronym HINOS. So, we are dealing with the three scenarios, and your call to learn ourselves, our own history, our own culture, our own tradition, is key to creating our own narrative. So going forward, the challenge with Indians is huge. Many people would say that NRIs are traitors to the country, they left and ran away. That's not the truth. The truth is that we were, we were struggling with our own scenarios. So that's what is key to going forward. How do we relate that conversation now going forward?
Yeah, it's a wonderful starting point. Let's just set it from a utilitarian point of view. I'm not one of those people who wants to talk about pure dharma and scripture if it has no utilitarian value to us. I'm a great believer that at this moment in time, everything that we share has to be of the maximum utility to the people who are taking the trouble to listen to it. They need to leave our conversations. They need to understand or feel that when they have stepped away from some time with us, they have stepped away with something of immense value. So let's just talk about the value of what it is that we're actually referring to, our dharmic civilization. And the way I like to think about it is that when each of us, every human being, we open our eyes on this planet at some point in time, and we find ourselves here. A moment comes when we close our eyes for the last time on this planet, and we don't really know what happens thereafter. But the intervening period, every human being wants to attain happiness, delight, joy, safety, security, prosperity, all of those things which are enshrined in human rights legislation. That's what we want to achieve. And we want to achieve it with the minimum amount of suffering for anybody else. And we want to achieve it with the minimum consumption of the earth's resources. This is the essence of what our dharmic civilization refined and produced and encapsulated and then recorded. That if you follow this understanding, you can go from point A to point B without ever having caused suffering to any other creature. And in the process, when you leave at point B, you leave with a big smile on your face. It's been an incredible journey. You have helped other people have an incredible journey, and you can settle and leave with a tranquil mind. So that is the purpose of every human society. It wants to do that. Every tribe wants to experience this. We mastered this. We refined this. We put the essence of what we had learned into rituals, into paintings, into dance, into language, into literature. Every single creation of our Sanatani civilization, it upholds those objectives. And so what we're talking about is not just one identity is better than another identity, is superior to a third identity, etc. And it's not about blind loyalty to a piece of land on its own. It's not about an unscrutinized loyalty to one's tribe. It is about how does the human being maximize the time that they are here, and what is it that we are here for. This is the essence of what it is we're wanting to preserve and share. Now, our philosophy is always that everybody has the freedom to explore. Everybody has the freedom to believe or disbelieve. Everybody has the freedom to ask the most robust questions that can be asked. And if each time a person does this, the responses have a utility value. The responses, they resonate in one's understanding and satisfy one's intellectual scrutiny, but they also satisfy one's emotional response. One should feel heartened, empowered, encouraged. All of the positive feelings should also be present. And so we have got the tradition which says, satisfy head, satisfy heart, and you will understand over a period of time what it is you're here for and how best to spend your time here. This is the gift that we have to share. This is the gift that we have to pass on, not only to our own subsequent generations now, but it is a global Kurukshetra. We are tasked with each and every one of us to share this understanding of how a human being can best exist on this planet, not just within people in the Bharatiya geographical space, but across the globe. And it's very interesting to note that not everybody can receive this information. And I often say to people that Devi Saraswati, she blesses whoever bows in front of her. Ganeshji showers his blessings upon anybody who has proven the adhikar. They have humility, they have a desire to understand. And those people now are occurring in every country across the globe. There are Americans who are flocking to yoga because it's so beneficial. In the United Kingdom, we have Ayurveda being rejuvenated and poured into. There are so many people of white European Christian origin who are now becoming the antithesis of he knows. What would we call these? Winos or something? I don't know. Hindus, we'll have to come up with an acronym, Vibhuti. People who are Hindus, but they are white. So that's white Hindus. And I'll start with the WH. I'll leave the rest to the audience to come up with. But we have now people who absolutely love the Sanatani civilization, even though it's not of their tradition. They're immensely valuable people to us, and we have to respect and nourish and nurture them. So this is now everywhere. Saraswati Deviji, she is looking for her acolytes in every corner of the world. Ganeshji is also desperate to pass on the blessings of Vidya and Gyan and wisdom to anybody who is willing to receive them. We have a bit of an advantage and a bit of a head start in that it's easier for us to receive those gifts. But we need to start putting the mechanisms in place, the systems in place, the language and the vocabulary in place so that this can now be disseminated. And each and every person who receives it will walk away with a benefit. This is the advantage of what we have to offer and the task at hand.
And you said it very well. You said it very well that Saraswati and everybody is there for us. Ganeshji is there to guide us. And the challenge that we face is that despite all the knowledge and wisdom that exists in our texts, we haven't cared to study. The challenge with the NRIs, the non-resident Indians, feel is that suddenly you are inundated with attacks. Look at America, for example, United States. We had, the attack on our symbol of Om, on swastik, not Om, swastik. And, it kind of created a flutter. It created a resistance. But the point of the matter is that we ourselves are not very clued in. So unless and until we are clued into our knowledge and history, we can't defend. We can't protect. And that's the challenge which the community is facing, because suddenly there is a debate and a dialogue in Silicon Valley of all places on caste-related issues, that Hindus and caste has to be protected. And lo and behold, the whole resolution passes despite the opposition by some groups that stood up to it, But a lot of Hindus supported that. So clearly there is a lack of awareness, lack of knowledge, and the desire to conform to whatever the white says here. And but alluding to your previous point, that I have seen it happen. The number of whites who are accepting our Sanatan principles, they find it very cool, quote unquote, because you really offer true freedoms. Because in our faith, Jesus is the only way. Well, as you say, go and pray to whatever you want, but eventually what you do defines you. So there is an immense conflict amongst the people who are not able to defend against the attacks on caste, on many gods. They're very fundamental questions. How do you think we play this game? And I would say, since I'm fond of cricket, you are living in the land of cricket. We have to play this game depending on the kind of game we are playing, whether we are playing T20, 50 overs, or a test match. What our strategy needs to be.
So we need to understand which game it is that we're playing. One mistake that we have made in the past is we assume that every engagement is a classroom. And that in a classroom, if you share knowledge, you share wisdom, it will be respected on the basis of the quality of what's being shared. And that works in a classroom. There's a dynamic in a classroom. There's a pupil, and indeed, there is a teacher, and there is an acknowledged understanding that information and wisdom is going to flow from one to the other, and so receptivity is there. That works really well in the classroom. But if you go into an adversarial space, where it's not about just the information, it's about the battle of words. If you go into a courtroom where one of the barristers is fully equipped with skillful arguments, with amazing rhetoric, with oratorial skills, and he can woo the jury, and he can raise their emotions and then lower them into the depths of unhappiness and then inspire them. When there is a person like that, if he confronts a bumbling barrister who has got the most wonderful evidence, there's a good opportunity that the evidence on its own will not be sufficient. And that's because the adversarial nature of that engagement already establishes the rules of the outcome. Jo jeeta wohi sikandar. That is the principle in that place. So number one is, when we play this game, we need to understand what the rules of the game are. We have a very crude but very direct English expression, which is, don't take a knife to a gunfight. Right? This is exactly what it is. And I think one of the issues we face so far is we have always felt if we can teach people about the truth and the reality of our scriptures and our philosophies and our principles, they will accept that at face value and our work is done. But what we haven't yet realized is that there are groups for whom our teachings, indeed for whom our very civilizational existence, threatens their established power structure. It threatens their livelihood. It threatens the bases upon which they control and manage and govern their populations. The last thing they want is us to produce, if I can use another analogy, if you have somebody who is used to selling colored glass as diamonds, the last thing he wants is a diamond merchant coming up and setting up shop in his city, because within a very short space of time, the population will recognize the difference between real diamonds and colored glass. They will recognize that they have been defrauded and lied to and held in deceit for such a long period of time, and they will seek justice. And so the last person who is going to be allowed to become a victor in those scenarios is the person who has something wonderful to offer. So we need to distinguish between the two. Now, I always engage, for example, in the interfaith arena, recognizing that it's not just a group of really nice, lovely, cuddly, warm-spirited clerics wanting to share the benefits and the wonders of their own religious traditions. That's not what interfaith in an Anglican space and often in most Christian spaces in the UK is about. It is about protecting territories. It's about trying to extract intellectual property from the other party so that you can then produce a counterfeit and introduce it into your own community and accept ownership of it. It's a very aggressive and devious forum within which this interfaith exchange now occurs. It's completely deceitful and completely fraudulent. But I recognize that's what it is. And so when I engage in those scenarios, I try and actually speak to the audience from that point of view. I want to win them over. I just don't want to be a Hino. I just don't want to be saying this is the archetypal Hindu who will slot into the pigeonhole that's already created in the framework of interfaith engagement. That would be a mistake. That would be playing into the enemy's hands. So we have to become very conversant with the framework within which we are functioning and the rules of that framework. If it is possible to have a win-win outcome, that's what we should seek. But if the framework is created to have a win-lose outcome, we should not accept losing just to be nice. We should be seeking victory to establish a better way for human beings to live with each other. That's a responsibility. So we need to become skillful in this engagement.
You use the word skillful in the engagement, and that's, it's not good enough to be nice. As somebody told me once, that the capacity of adjustment and accommodation amongst the Hindus is so wide and so strong that we want to be like Mike. We want to be, wherever we go, we merge and become like them. That is a time when we become unworthy of ourselves, because we already adjusted. We wanted to be like Mike and we became like Mike. That's one of the problems with us Hindus the way we are, because we want to adjust, we want to feel nice. It's like something like a senator once told me, that we love you Indians as migrants to this country, immigrants to this country. You are professionals, you are hardworking, you bring professional values, you have family values, you take care of your children. You are least problem from a law and order perspective, apart from the occasional white collar crime, and you ask for nothing. This particular thing that we merged with them has somewhere along the line impacted our own identity. And I sincerely believe in Ramayan's Lakshman Rekha concept. We all need to draw a Lakshman Rekha in behavior,
Yes.
conduct, invasion, and whatever else. We haven't drawn the line. We have crossed the line. So my request would be that while all this exists, there is a tremendous gap between what we know and what our text says. That affects our essential being, because we think we deserve more, but we are not getting it because we are not playing the game per rules, because we don't even know the turf that we are on. That's very critical for us to know. So how does one take the leap, the next stage of leap? Knowledge.
It's an unbelievably powerful question. So here's something that every Hindu, and in fact, not just every Hindu, but every member of a former colony should give some thought to. And that is that being tolerated, being appreciated, being respected are all different things. We often mistake being appreciated for being respected. So in your dealings with people of the host community or the dominant community, I always suggest ask the question, are you being appreciated or are you being respected? Because a slave is appreciated. A slave is tolerated because some benefit is derived by the existing power structure. And so, yes, we get lots of pats on the back, but are we being appreciated and also being exploited at the same time? Because every dominant, aggressively colonialist society, it wants cooperating slaves. It wants people who can do work for it. It wants people who can create wealth. It wants people who can look after the population in the medical infrastructure. It wants people who can teach children. But it wants to exploit each and every one of those in order to retain its vision and its control on where that society is going. And this is one of our biggest problems. We have a history of contributing to our own enslavement. We have a history of our efforts and our labor and our wealth being used to deny us the opportunity to exist as equals. A prime example is the scenario in Bharat at the moment where Hindu temples, the funds are contributed by the Hindu community, and yet the Hindu community does not have exclusive benefit from those funds. That's a great example of being appreciated and being thoroughly exploited at the same time. So I think this is the first question that we should ask. Are we being allowed to contribute a civilizational vision, or are we just exchequer fodder? Is the only contribution that we're actually really making is filling the coffers of the state so that the state can continue to oppress us as well as other people? So question number one, are we being appreciated? Are we being exploited? Or are we actually being respected? Now, if we're not yet being respected, how do we move from being appreciated, exploited to being respected? This is absolutely paramount. And a part of that is to start to be able to talk of our own history. If we cannot make this leap, what happens is our next generation, they make the leap and leave behind everything that they think was negative and holding them back. They want to achieve success in the society which has defined what success is for them. Society has a contract with individuals, doesn't it? It often says, if you do A, B, C, and D, then here are the rewards that you can expect to receive. And more often than not, those rewards are not necessarily what are granted. But our children don't realize that until it's 40 years too late, that what they left behind might have been of greater value. And in fact, they have bought sackcloth, which they thought was silk. And that has been sold to them under false pretenses. So the first thing is to establish, are we being genuinely respected, or are we just being exploited? We have earned the right to be respected. We have earned the right to be able to contribute not just of our labor, but of our ancestral wisdom. If we have better ways for human beings to live with each other, if we have better guidelines for human beings to conduct an exploration into divinity, if we have a better understanding of how the ecosystem works, why are we not being allowed to contribute those visions? It's because we're not being respected. So that is my first step, I think, that my suggestion as the first step that we all need to take.
And you said it very correctly, that whether appreciation, respect, and I say that we have allowed ourselves to be taken for granted. And that's very critical, because everything that happens to you and I is a function of choice. You are here by choice. I'm here by choice. Somewhere along the line, we missed that entire terminology. That, think about it, it really angers me, and it really violates my all thinking capacity when I see that 1941 census clearly lays down, informs us that there were approximately 145,000 British in the country, in India, plus women and children. They ruled us, over us millions, using our resources, our people, against us, impoverished us. Churchill is famous for being held responsible for 2 million deaths or whatever number of deaths in famine. But he is reckoned as hero. Even today in India, people quote Churchill as if he was some humorous, funny guy, because to be in our living rooms. How do we explain that mindset? I mean, despite all the knowledge and wisdom that exists, the intelligence that exists, are we the people? We have allowed ourselves to suffer from educated incapacity, my favorite phrase. That सब कुछ जानते हुए भी अगर आप कुछ नहीं कर रहे हैं, तो कहाँ गई आपकी विद्वता फिर? Where is your wisdom?
Yes, this is the question of the time. And I often point to the experience of our Kashmiri Pandits who met with violence, and despite having access to some of the highest wisdom on the planet, were unable to respond to that violence for whatever reasons. In a more recent and a slightly larger scenario, the experience of the Tibetans. Again, spiritual wisdom, pretty much at the pinnacle of many aspects of spiritual adhyatmic sadhana, and yet they weren't able to defend themselves when the Chinese, in a very barbaric act, just walked in, slaughtered left, right, and center, and said, "This is ours." So there is a question, and the question is, how does reason meet force? This is at the heart of the issue, and we have to work out how to use what we know in order to stand up against force. Now that's a conversation for a session on its own.
Yeah.
But in terms of what you were asking, there is a glimmer of hope. We can ask that question in a number of ways and see different answers to it. Here is a perspective. At this moment in time, we as Bharatiyas, the global diaspora included, all of us have within us a resonance of the atrocities that were inflicted on our society for the last 1400 years. I remember my grandfather telling me that when he was a child, when a white Gorasab used to come into the village on a horse, the children would hide. They were so fearful of what this person was going to do. They were that devastated by the barbaric acts that were being done. And so that is still within us, and it's slowly being worked out. We have now gotten to the stage where we can fill our stomachs, we can cover our heads with roofs, we can work in a manner to sustain our existence, and we are now moving into that stage where we're building our networks and rediscovering our access to higher wisdom. But one body of knowledge which we have not yet, shall we say, mastered, and it's a tough one for people like us to do, is to master the body of low cunning. How does low cunning actually work? Right? And the Mahabharata is a wonderful example because it took such a long time for the brothers to recognize that they were not dealing with people of value, who had values and morals and who had a compass that they were living with, according to, that had principles that were acting as the North Star to guide all of their decisions. It took a long time for them to recognize that they needed a different manner of engagement. And I don't believe they recognized it, not until it became an existential threat for them. And I call this the 5 villages moment, that when even Sri Krishnji, as the Shanti Dut, his offer was rejected, and people said, we're not even going to let, Duryodhana's response was, we're not even going to give you 5 villages. That is a clear existential threat. And we're at that point. We need to recognize that there are people for whom our existence, and indeed the revelation of the atrocities inflicted on the people of Bharat, pose a threat. And so they would lose enormously if the whole world knew what was done in Bharat. The day that the true tally of deaths of Hindus that occurred within the British occupation of India becomes public knowledge, it will be a day of international mourning. The British will not be able to rebut the evidence that's being gathered and collated. And that has to happen because in it is our healing. We need to heal. And when we have fully healed, we will then be in that position where we can say, right, we now need to understand how evil, cunning people work. For us, that's quite a difficulty. I remember hearing a remark made once by a professor who teaches in the American military services, and he said, history always requires some people to become less than they are so that the others can stay who they are. So if you have a highly civilized situation, it requires a few people to become less civilized because they're dealing with people who are less civilized. And that is the challenge for us. We need to be intellectually capable of understanding the nature of the cunning mind, which is happy to destroy, wreak havoc, and in fact even inflict a scorched earth policy on a whole civilization just because it is hollow inside, just because they themselves are cunning and are driven by very base instincts. This is the stage where we're at. We're now gathering sufficient breath and sufficient resources to be able to survive. And the next stage is to understand, well, what are the threats and why do they function the way they do? And what can we now do to meet those threats in the most dharmic manner? And that is personally, I think that's an exciting challenge. I think it's a wonderful opportunity for people of genuine wisdom and people with some adhyatmic pran shakti available to them to raise the conversation to that level now and to engage in a dharmic manner with this issue. How do we face force when we are people who prefer to use reason?
No, you brought out some issues which are bleeding obvious. And when we don't see the bleeding obvious, then we end up bleeding ourselves. So the point is, like Mahabharata and Ramayana, you gave the wonderful narration of the historical truth that the Krishna's teachings of five village, they never understood. They realized later. Today's, if you transfer that, the entire technology leap of knowledge and understanding that has come about, we still are indulging in appeasement and pandering. Still, is it a human weakness? Or is it our belief that keep doing it, hopefully it will work sometime? The second word that you phrase that you used was existential threat. And that's important because about 6 or 7 years ago, a friend of mine who is a very famous journalist in India wrote an article that the famous or infamous Bhutto's 1,000-year war with India has another 950 years to go. And I responded to him by saying, no, you missed the point. That Islam had actually won its first 1,000-year war because we have given up Afghanistan, our basis of Gandhar Naresh. We have given away Pakistan and Bangladesh as two Islamic republics. So India was cut off, hived off, to become three separate Islamic republics, right? We do face an existential threat because under the banner, because your enemy uses your own strengths against you. Under the banner of democratic aspirations of people, how far are we really away from another onslaught happening in India that we end up becoming refugees in our own homes? Saraswati Dham and Sharda Peeth is an example. The concentration
Precisely.
of population happening in Haridwar and Varanasi is an example. There is a definite effort being made to unseat our seats of learning. How do we contest that? What do we do?
And democracy is one of those ideas which needs protection. And I think most people don't understand the principles of what a democracy is. We have on the borders of Bharat some very courageous people who have said we're willing to sacrifice our very life in order to protect the democratic processes that have been put into place in Bharat, the way in which Bharat wants to conduct its affairs. That's the purpose of the armed forces, to protect against those which would destroy our democratic society. And so the democratic society itself, we need to understand that it only functions on one principle. All of democracy functions on the principle of loser's consent. That if you lose, then you consent to the other party bringing their vision into reality. If you imagine a cricket pitch, that works. The cricket match works on loser's consent. That after the rules have been agreed, people engage on the battlefield. Whoever is the loser, they consent to allow the winners to go and get the golden cup. But imagine a cricket match where after having lost, the other team say, well, no, what we're going to do now is we're going to burn the wickets, we're going to dig up the pitch, and we're going to demand that we have at least 50% of that cup, because not to give it to us would be an act of discrimination. No loser's consent. And so without loser's consent, there is no genuine democracy. I think Bharat needs to ask itself, and Indians need to ask themselves, are we actually engaging in democratic processes with people who actually would like to see democracy destroyed, and because they do not accept loser's consent? Now, this is the refusal to accept loser's consent. It applies in a theocratic state as well. We have people for whom the democratic processes are a major inconvenience. They're only a major inconvenience for a short period of time until they can dismantle a democracy and replace it with a theocracy. People who want to do that, they are not adhering to, and they don't respect the notion of loser's consent, so they're not democratic. Their processes are exactly the same as the processes of those people who are beyond the boundaries of the nation, wanting to attack the nation and its systems and its people. It's the same ideology. I think this is going to be a stark reality which we need to recognize. And one of the challenges will be, how do we deal democratically with people who don't respect democratic process? That's at the heart of this issue, isn't it? We need to find solutions to these. I think one aspect of it that we don't really do well enough, and this brings us to the heart of our own conversation, is the narrative building. There are globally many, many countries, many peoples who would support the democratic aspirations of Bharat, and yet we don't recruit their support actively. If I can take everybody back to the Iraq War, Tony Blair and George Bush, they built a consensus of nations, and that consensus allowed them to then wreak havoc on Iraq, even though there were no weapons of mass destruction. And the power of that consensus building was so powerful that Tony Blair walks the streets free, even though he took Britain into an illegal war, which everybody acknowledges was an illegal war. But the consensus was so powerful that nobody is now stepping forward to say, well, actually, Tony, you need to be locked up. You need to be brought before the Crimes Against Humanity Tribunal in The Hague. Power of narrative building and consent. We need to reach out and develop that consensus. And that means we need to control our own narrative skillfully and with a sense of urgency. Otherwise, as they say, I believe it's a saying from the Deep South, your home nation at this moment in time, you need hate to hang a dog. Dogs are such lovable, cute creatures. And so people love dogs. But if you're going to kill a dog, you need to make sure that everybody hates the dog so that once you've killed the dog, nobody then comes and attacks you for having done it. And that is the challenge that we face. There are people who want to create hatred for Hindus. And it's the same campaign, it's the same pernicious, vicious campaign which has existed for a long period of time against us. We need to challenge that narrative.
We definitely need to challenge that narrative because it's very important, because our values, our Sanatan principles are eternally relevant for the rest of the world. You know, that's what is important. It's a pity that a concept of Jesus is the only way and Allah is supreme and halal certification becomes a global economic tools, whereas the very essential principles of life and living is ignored as intolerant. I mean, that's for us to begin to talk about. If democracy is the best available worst pattern, maybe we should give a try to democracy as a principle to bring about authentic equal rule or a rule of equality. Now, there is one thing, and the last thing that I want to talk about, touch about in the last 1 or 2 minutes. One of the things that India is constantly attacked with is about caste and the total confusion that exists about Varna. And I have my own answer to this question, and I say, whenever any American has asked me that you have a serious caste problem, instead of contesting, I said, yes, it is. But this is the British imposed caste system that we have. But before that, we had a Varna system in which, even today, the world is still divided in a caste basis. It's nothing else but a division of labor, badly implemented in India, but it's working everywhere else. So everyone who is part of the governance, whether the prime minister or president, to the lowest functionary in a village or a taluka or a county, is part of the government. They are the modern Brahmins. Everybody who is a warrior, whether he's protecting an asset of a gated community or what you call a warrior in the battlefield or a bank property, whatever, they're willing to give life to protect an asset. They are the modern warriors. Everybody from Bill Gates, Buffett to Ambani to everybody, mom and pop shops or selling pan and cigarette in front of an Indian restaurant. They are all trade and commerce. And the bankers, the accountants, the cost accountants, the doctors, IT people, they are all service industry. So this is the way the caste is still prevalent all over the world. So how does one attest to that and dismantle the attack that we are the worst kind of casteist people, which we are not?
So a number of ideas that I'd like to explore then. As you know, I became an involuntary expert on the history of this particular phenomenon in the Bharatiya society. I needed to because of the allegations that were being brought against our British Hindu community by members of the evangelical church. So I studied the whole phenomenon. And here's one thing which I was clear about and most people overlook. Firstly, let's assume that there is within Sanatan Dharam this terrible system. And not for a moment am I admitting that as being truth, but let's assume that as a hypothetical. Even if there is, the last thing we need is people who have a conflict of interest interfering with us. We are perfectly capable of dealing with this issue, and more capable of dealing with this issue than white saviors. So I often say to people, we don't have just a caste problem. A bigger problem for us is the white savior problem. Especially if they're a white person, then I will say to them, well, actually, no, I'd much rather speak to you about your colonialist history. I'd much rather speak to you about the fact that Jesus Christ was the name of the first slave ship that left Britain and went onto those shores. I'd much rather speak to you about the philosophy behind why Hypatia, one of the most wonderful woman scholars of the classical world, was torn limb from limb by Christians. Now that's an incredible philosophy. Let's talk about that, because that's part of what you said earlier about relaying a boundary, the Lakshman Rekha. So even if this is a problem, it's a problem that we can resolve by working together within a Lakshman Rekha. And the first step is to throw out those people for whose interest conflict and strife would actually be an improvement. So there is a conflict of interest issue. I always look for a person's conflict of interest. In financial circumstances, in political circumstances, we are all required to declare our conflicts of interest. I have sat in a religious gathering and I said, okay, I'd like everybody first to declare if they have a religious conflict of interest, because we can't have a conversation if your interest is in actually undermining my connection with my ancestors. That's a conflict of interest. And if you've not got a conflict of interest, then we can genuinely have an exploration. So the first step that we have to understand is, if this problem exists, we can better resolve it without the interference of a third party whose interests lie in concealing their own atrocities in Bharat, and whose interests lie in making sure that our religious traditions are undermined. Step one, we need to get rid of the white savior problem part of this issue. Step two is that there is a dimension to this caste issue which is firmly rooted in what happened in colonial times. The reason this issue for the last 80, 90, 100 years has been such a terrible blight on the Indian society lies in acts, in authority, in decisions, in social engineering, which occurred during colonial rules. And so if anybody wants to have a caste conversation, the first thing they need to do is to understand what the background to it is. In Ayurveda, we don't deal with just the symptoms. We try and dig down to the root cause of any particular issue. And I think those people who derive a lot of benefit from the caste issue, there are political agents who derive a lot of benefit. I think what we have to do first is to look at the background as well and say, okay, the background, here are some impetuses, here are some events, here are some factors which are relevant to this. Let's deal with those, and then we can move on to the impact of those factors. Let's deal with the root cause, then we can look at the symptoms and try and heal those. Friction in our own community, it's like a fever, isn't it? There is tension between groups. There are hatreds, many of them lie in fact, many of them lie in discrimination, many of them lie in prejudice, many of them lie in propaganda. We need to be able to identify each and every one and then start addressing them, because Sanatan Dharam is built upon the understanding that each and every human being is Atma and potentially divine, and that the journey that all of us make, the best society, is the journey that helps every person to discover the divinity within them, irrespective of what task and work they do whilst they are here between birth and death. So this is an issue where we have now worked out the strategy as well as got the information and the evidence together. And so we're ready to step into this space with compassion, with a desire for everyone's benefit, but a desire for justice to also be a significant part of this discussion. So we're very much ready. Let's move it forward.
Let's move it forward. And that seems like a plan. And that seems like an action plan, which is what I am all about. Knowing what we know now, what do we need to do? To all the uninitiated, anxious, eager, willing, but looking for direction, come and join our channel, subscribe to our channel, because we are trying to create a new narrative of India thinks Hindu and everything that matters to us, which ought to matter to us. We can't allow ourselves to be taken for granted. So subscribe to our channel, like, share, let the world know. And I'm very happy. There are many more people coming in with their own ideas of disseminating the knowledge of Sanatan and the principle. I feel sometimes that the world is afraid of us. It's not Hinduphobia, but it is afraid of us, because eventually, the organized religion has its base on fear and ignorance. We are not. We are science-based. So when President Biden talks about science-based, I'm delighted. Let's confront the challenge science-based. When G7 imposes another kind of an imperialism around the world as if they are the ultimate beholders of the world's security, I wonder, what the real intent is. So let's begin to ask questions. Let's begin to inquire. Let's begin to debate and dialogue, all right? So thank you very much for joining. Thank you, Sharma ji, for being here. Catch up with you again soon. Satyamir.
It's my pleasure. Indeed. And Jai Shri Ram, it's my pleasure. And best wishes. Again, I would add my support for the channel and encourage everybody who is watching. It's time to get engaged. It doesn't matter how you get engaged. If you have questions to ask, come into the conversation, contribute those questions. If there's something that we've said which is which conflicts with what you know and understand, please come and share it. This is an open conversation. It's an open invitation. And I think Jaipur Dialogues is doing a wonderful task in opening out to an ever new audience. So please do get involved. And I hope to see you in the very near future on the channel again. Thank you very much, Vibhuti.
Thank you. Satyameva Jayate. Take care.